Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a very important and timely conversation. This conversation is part of our JStream offerings during the COVID period, trying to build community to bring about progressive change while so many of us are isolated, coming together to work toward the change we need. And this is perhaps the most significant and timely conversation we've had yet. We're here with Rashad Robinson. He is the president of Color of Change, a leading racial justice organization with more than 1.4 million members. Rashad designs winning strategies to build power for Black communities, moving prosecutors to reduce mass incarceration and police violence, forcing over 100 corporations to abandon the right-wing policy shop ALEC, forcing corporations to stop supporting Trump initiatives and white nationalists, winning net neutrality as a civil rights issue, changing representations of race in Hollywood, moving Airbnb, Google, and Facebook to implement anti-racist initiatives, forcing Bill O'Reilly off the air. Rashad appears regularly in major news media. You may have even seen him at President Obama's very important roundtable earlier this week. And he was among the first in a global cohort of Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equality. He writes a monthly column about race, politics, and corporate accountability for The Guardian, which is excellent. And if you haven't yet, you should check it out. And we're here with Rashad with heavy hearts this week. You may have seen J Street's statement earlier this week. We mourn the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and too many others at the hands of police violence. And we also mourn the death of Iyad al-Halak at the hands of Israeli police in the Palestinian territory. We're here to discuss how we can channel our collective energy as we look ahead toward November up and down the ballot, while acknowledging that not any single election outcome is going to suffice in bringing us closer to the racial justice that we hope to see in this country. So we're also here to talk about how we can follow the lead of and get behind movement leaders like Rashad, who have been doing this important work day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out. So we're really grateful for your time, particularly in this really significant moment, Rashad. What I'd like to do to start things off is just turn things over to you for some opening reflections, and also maybe just a brief 101 on Color of Change's important work for those of us who are new to it.
Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. Looking forward to the questions. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at. And I think we are at an inflection point. And the thing about inflection points is that they present a real opportunity for us to go forward, but they also present so much potential for us to go backwards. And what we do in this moment will tell the story and will create the reality about where we actually go. And so in so many ways, at Color of Change, we work to channel the presence that Black people have in the world into the power to actually change the rules. Far too often, we mistake presence for power, visibility and awareness, retweets, stories on the front page of the paper, people saying that they care or that they're with us for actual change that needs to happen. And so in this moment, we need to make sure that as more and more people than ever before are taking action, a more diverse array of people are standing up to get involved, that we actually work to change the rules. Sometimes the written rules of policy, and other times the unwritten rules of culture. And that really gets me to Color of Change and who we are and what we do and what we're doing now. So Color of Change was founded 15 years ago in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina. It was caused by bad decision makers, and it turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. For those of you, you might remember those images of Black people on their roofs, begging for the government to do something and literally left to die. You know, the way that Katrina animates our theory of change about how we do our work is that it illustrated a lot of things that people already knew. Geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and so much more. But at the heart of what was going on in Katrina was that no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. And when institutions like government and corporations and media are not nervous about disappointing your community, it doesn't matter what kind of research report that illustrates all the facts and figures. It doesn't matter what you do in the courts. If you don't have the power to implement it, we can just look at how segregated our schools are decades upon decades after Brown versus Board of Education. It doesn't matter what our friends in Silicon Valley build, and it oftentimes doesn't even matter what kind of charitable service organizations we have. In moments like Katrina, and dare I say moments like COVID, which is kind of like Katrina's all around the country, you can't research your way or policy your way or code your way or nonprofit executive direct your way out. You actually need to build people power and need narrative change. And at the heart of our work is the ability to channel the passions, the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations of Black folks and our allies of every race into actually making real change. And so that first email in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina that went to about 1,000 people, that asked people to join a new movement for social change, has led to an explosion of over the years. You know, we talked about ourselves before the crisis as a movement of about between 1.7 and 1.4 million members. We really talk about our membership as people who have taken action with us in the last 8 months. So it's not anyone that's ever signed a petition. We're having to think a little bit different about that right now. 4 million people over 4 million people have signed our Justice for George petition. Over 6 million people now have taken action with us in the last 8 months. Over 5 million people have engaged with us on our SMS platforms. And so the simple fact of the matter is we are experiencing a huge flood of people who want to take action. And so what does that mean? What does it mean when we ask people to sign a petition? Because we live in a kind of digital age where you get a lot of petitions and it can feel like whack-a-mole, that game at the carnival where something pops up and you hit it down and something else pops up and you hit it down. Well, we think constantly about what are we asking people to do and how are we helping people take strategic action? So you'll never see a petition from Color of Change that says, tell Mitch McConnell to stand up for affirmative action. Because no matter how many people sign that petition, there's no way that a petition of Black folks and allies is gonna force Mitch McConnell or change Mitch McConnell's mind on affirmative action. And so we're constantly thinking about what are the levers we're pulling in order to actually force institutions to change. As it comes to justice for the victims of police violence, we're doing what we constantly do. First, we're giving people the ability to take action, and sometimes that looks different, right? In the Obama era, we were oftentimes pushing the Justice Department to get involved when we felt that we didn't have the power at the local level. We no longer bring petitions to the Justice Department during the Trump age because there's actually no leverage. There's no interest in working with communities of ours. So we're constantly pivoting our energy to the right local sort of entities. And far too often that is district attorneys. And the reason why I say too often is because we've had to figure out how to build new power around district attorneys. And so we've launched a new we launched an initiative a couple of years ago called Winning Justice, winningjustice.org. And Winning Justice is the only searchable database of the 2,400 prosecutors in this country. And it is a place where you can go and actually learn information about your prosecutor. We leverage the power of volunteers to keep it crowdsourced. We have a video content that helps people understand what prosecutors do. And we've worked across the movement to build education tools, as well as align around 6 clear demands for prosecutors. While people are watching what's happening in Georgia and Minnesota and so many other places around the country, Tennessee, you too, and most people, live in a place where they have a prosecutor that will not prosecute the police when they harm or hurt Black people. You live in a place with a prosecutor that is driving up mass incarceration because the United States has 4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. And so we don't get to this overnight or just by one place. And we don't get out of this simply by ideas alone. We get out of this by building the type of power that changes the rules and forces those in power to have to do something different. And so over the last several years, we've worked to change the way in which prosecutors have to engage with us, sometimes having to get into elections on our more political side, but most of the time having to engage behind the scenes, leveraging the power that we might get involved in the election, but leveraging community engagement, working inside and outside to change the rules around money bail, around drug around drugs and how and whether or not people were going to be sentenced for them, sentencing in general, creating deeper levels of transparency, all with the recognition that the vast majority of people are incarcerated at the local level. We're doing that while we're doing other things in Hollywood to change the story. For the last 20 years in this country, violent crime has basically steadily went down. But most Americans believe that violent crime is going up, according to Pew and everyone else. And so there's a gap between perception and reality. And that gap creates all sorts of challenges for us to be able to create the type of long-term change. So before I get to questions, what I want you to know is that at Color of Change, we are working to build a powerful 21st century movement that uses technology and builds the type of energy that centers the joy, the brilliance, the creativity, and the passion of Black folks to make change, but invites allies of every race into this conversation with the recognition that we're not in an ideas gap, we are in a power gap. And we need to build that in order to force those to do something different. And sometimes that is in the cultural space, and far too often that is in every space. And so that is the work that we're doing. That's the work we're doing to make justice real. The final thing I'll just say is that we've been doing that while also having to respond to the COVID crisis. And if we were talking a couple of weeks ago, I would have been talking about the Black Response. The blackresponse.org is our action hub around ensuring that Black folks are getting the type of protections, the type of policies that our communities deserve. All of the ways in which this virus is exposing the failures, the exploitation, the targeting of our communities, the virus of bad decisions that preceded it and the virus of bad decisions that followed COVID have put us in harm's way. And as a result, we are working to build power through the Black Response. And there's a wide range of campaigns, from protecting and ensuring that small businesses get what they need, to fighting for decarceration in our prison and jails where social distancing is impossible, to ensuring that we're able to actually cast a ballot this election cycle and fighting for vote by mail options. All of these are part of engagement, of building power. You know, very often, people think of racial justice as charity. And I'm not going to say it's not charity. People think of racial justice as the thing we've got to do because it's the right thing to do, and we want to ensure that we don't leave Black and brown people out, and that's good too. But I want to implore to all of you, I want to invite all of you into the idea that racial justice is not charity, that racial justice is strategy. That racial justice is the strategy for us building the type of movements that undo all of the things that ensure that we don't have a true democracy. Because at the heart of our current sort of system is all of these norms and practices that were built on faulty ground. That racial justice is the thing that is getting people out into the streets in new ways to make their voices heard, and is creating a new level of energy across race, of standing up for one another and standing with one another for change. And that is racial justice that is driving that. So we should be thinking about racial justice, not just about what we are doing for others, but how racial justice can be a force multiplier for ourselves. It can be the tool to allow us to get the politicians in office that will help us save our planet, that can protect us against the rise of white nationalists, that can ensure our economy is there to make sure that people can afford and pay for the things that they need, that corporate power is kept in check. All of these things can be part of what we win together when we recognize that racial justice is a pathway for all of us to be more powerful in this country. So I'm going to stop there and open for questions, but thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks, Rashad, which were both uplifting and pushed all of us on this call to think critically. I want to pick up on a few themes that you raised. And as I do that, I'll remind folks on the call with us, first of all, thank you again for joining us. Second of all, If you have a question, you can submit a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take them kind of on an ongoing basis. But Rashad, just an opening thought, building on that theme of racial justice as strategy. We at J Street, we're cognizant of the fact that, number one, we're an organization primarily organized around pushing for peace in Israel-Palestine. We're an organization not exclusively, but mainly driven by American Jews, mostly white, mostly privileged. And that we're also, not just in moments like these, but because we're motivated and inspired by our Jewish and progressive values, we understand that we have a responsibility to follow the leaders of the racial justice movement in this country to join in that fight and push for racial justice. We want to do those so in a humble way, and we want to do so in a strategic way, like you said. So from your perspective, as one of the leading strategists in this movement to defend Black lives, what are you looking for from organizations like ours? What unique tactics can we bring to the table to amplify your efforts? What can we do, not just in moments like this, but this is a fight that's been ongoing, and what can we do in a sustainable fashion into the future to aid in this important fight?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think that there are ways in which both of our communities are under attack, and we need to find ways that we are flanking one another when we can. And I think I think about, what does it mean when groups are out front fighting really powerful forces, and the flanking that's needed. I think a lot about the rise of white nationalists in this country, and the sort of unique ways in which both of our communities have had to face these forces, and ways in which in the history of this country we've found ourselves standing together, and then oftentimes have watched as forces have driven us apart. And so, I think it's being really clear about sort of who's the enemy in these moments, and how do we collectively force them. One thing that we've done over the last several years is work to deal with the ways that corporate power has sort of challenged our community, and in some ways allowed for white nationalism to thrive. And so, we are dealing with fights around the funding of white nationalists, and had to spend a lot of time with financial institutions like big banks and others, and trying to force them to cut off the processing for white nationalist organizations, the groups that were marching in Charlottesville and elsewhere, and spent a lot of time as those organizations, as those banks would say, as the credit card companies would say, go to the banks, and the banks would say, go to the credit card companies. And no one wanted to take responsibility. And so what does it mean to build a powerful movement where different folks can play different parts, and different folks can flank each other in different organizations, and forcing those in power to see things differently? We are going to be dealing with, in this criminal justice moment, not just the sort of influx of new people wanting to make change, not just the debates about what ideas are going to make sense, but we're going to be dealing with a lot of entrenched forces that are going to stand in our way. And in particular, we're going to be dealing with the Fraternal Order of Police and police associations. And I know this is a tricky thing to talk about, because we sometimes want to think that, if we just bring people together, we can make change. But if any movement will tell you that, it's the gun rights movement, right? That where they can have 70 and 80% polling on their issue, and every time they move forward, they face the NRA. And so we're going to need folks that are not just Black to be helping us push back at these institutions that will, that when chokeholds become illegal, they find new ways for chokeholds to exist. That when mayors stand up and try to advance reforms, that police unions, and even reforms that are not as advanced as we need them to be, that the police unions have their police turn their backs on those mayors or those politicians. That we have an experience that I had in the White House with President Obama, where he brought some of us together to talk about these issues, and the police union was there, and the head of the police union said to Brian Stevenson and myself that all of this talk of racial profiling is new to him. It's not that he didn't believe that he believed that we were asking for too much, or we had disagreements on the path forward, but that he was saying that the problem doesn't even exist. So when I think about what does it mean to have folks who identify as white and identify as maybe privileged, and have and sort of sit inside of communities that are not ours, to be speaking out and pushing back, to join us in an idea of what does safety and justice look like, because far too often the type of policies, the type of rules that police are allowed to benefit from are done in your name. They're done in the name of white folks. They're done in the name of people who are not Black. They're done in the name of protecting folks outside of our community. I talked about that gap between perception and reality that comes out of Hollywood that we are working so hard to push. We just did a report with the Norman Lear School at USC on crime TV shows. You can find it at changehollywood.org. And we worked on that report with a set of brilliant researchers, multiracial researchers, that really helped us dig into all of the ways in which these TV shows have very diverse casts, have a magical world of diversity on screen, but a land where sort of Black and brown people exist, but racism doesn't. The final thing I'll say about your question, and I guess the call for that was for us to be more active viewers, and for us to continue to use our power in spaces where we have them to push and to challenge. The final thing I'll say is just about the story that we tell about this moment. I think even the best of us, whether we are allies, whether we are part of the community, can sometimes use language and words that don't actually build the type of power. And both of our communities have experience with being talked about or being talked at. And so I know you all will understand this, but I want to kind of give you all some really practical sort of ways in which I want to talk about this. Far too often, we will talk about Black communities as vulnerable. We'll say Black people and Black communities are vulnerable. And, you know, vulnerability is a personal trait. I like to think of myself as better than this, but I'm probably sometimes vulnerable when I like see an ex on social media who's really happy. I feel sort of vulnerable about that. And that's personal trait, right? That means like I have to fix myself. There's something I gotta like work on so I don't like show up wrong. Black communities are under attack. We have been targeted. We have been exploited. When we talk about communities as vulnerable, then we focus people on fixing those communities. We focus people on fixing those families instead of fixing the systems that have exploited them and targeted them. We'll say things like, Black people are less likely to get loans from banks, instead of saying banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. We don't just say this about Black people. We will say that women are less likely to get jobs in tech, instead of saying tech is less likely to hire women. When the thing is, what happens is that we end up trying to fix the people instead of fix the systems. We end up with mentorship programs instead of changing systemic exclusion. We end up with stories about unfortunate situations instead of unjust. And when we tell stories of unjust instead of, and we tell stories that are unfortunate rather than unjust, we end up with charitable solutions to structural problems. So what I mean by charitable solutions to structural problems is people feel like it's enough to send water bottles to Flint instead of cleaning up the pipes. People feel like it's enough to do a service day at an inner city school instead of actually changing public education. And what I think we are seeing right now on the streets is the failure of the charity state, of the idea that we can sort of fix these problems that we have in our society without changing the rules, that we can do things for people instead of giving people the tools to do for themselves. And so part of what we have to do in this moment is build a new type of energy and a new type of story. And the final thing I'll say about this story is that the news media, our own communities, even I have to check it in my own organization sometimes when I think about the content we put out. And so I want to say that we're all susceptible to this, and I think we all have an opportunity to change, is that we constantly tell stories of Black pain. We constantly tell stories of Black people at the margins who are marginalized. This is why we talk about folks as vulnerable. And yes, we have to tell the truth so that we can actually build the power to change it. We have to tell what's actually happening so we can move it, but we also have to tell the full truth. So while we're telling those stories of pain, we need to tell the stories of Black brilliance and Black creativity. We need to tell the stories of how Black people have helped to build this country and helped to create all sorts of pathways for how we think about activism. As I traveled around the world, I've people talk about the sort of civil rights movement and the work that we've done in this country, before I was born, to create a new tomorrow. People sing our songs and chant our chants and think about our strategies. I think about in this moment of COVID, the way that Black people have been at the heart of essential workers, providing food and comfort and all the things that people need, while also providing some of the most creative spaces online, on IG Live and other places for people to come together and celebration. And so, yes, we have to tell those stories of pain, but when a community is only framed in a deficit, then we actually don't tell the full story. Black people are a protagonist in the American story. And protagonists are people that you root for and you fight for. And I believe that we can win, but we can only win if we are part of the story of not just fighting against things and fighting for. And that's why when I talk about Black joy and centering Black joy in our work, Black joy is not the absence of pain, but it's the presence of aspiration, the presence of what we are fighting for. And so as I give the advice to you all, and that was a bit long-winded, but as I give the advice to you all, my hope is that we think about all the ways that we engage and support and flank organizations and institutions, and we think about how we tell the story so that we get the outcomes and the sort of advocacy that we need, that we don't just get charity, but we get structural change, that we get people seeing us as a protagonist and therefore fighting for us and fighting with us. Those are the things that I think could be most helpful in channeling this inflection point into the type of progress that 5, 10, 15 years from now, we can look back on and feel proud that we were here in this moment and that we did something in this moment to make this country live up to its ideals.
Powerful. I'm getting a number of questions in the queue about a number of the themes you just addressed. To turn from the strategy to the theme of vulnerability, say, that you just raised. Don't worry, we won't make you talk about any of your exes.
Thank you.
But I'm struck by the story you shared about yours and Brian Stevenson's visit to the White House with that police official too. And I think a number of these questions strike on a couple of these themes. You and Color of Change, so much important work to push powerful people who benefit from discriminatory systems to move toward challenging those systems. And whether that's in Hollywood, like you mentioned, Silicon Valley, or beyond. And I'm wondering if it could be a general recollection, or it could be a specific account of one such instance that might be useful. I'm getting a bunch of questions in the queue that are just more about doing the work individually. That might be useful to recount for those on the call who might be in such a position of power.
Yeah, this is that's a really helpful question. We're dealing with some of this right now at Facebook. So we've been engaged in advocacy around Facebook. And I'll tell the quick Facebook story because I think it's a story of inside-outside strategy. We would not be sort of where we're at right now without people on the inside helping us push, without people raising their voices, or people speaking out, sometimes reaching out to us and sometimes just doing it through their own sort of ways. But what's been really interesting is that our work started years ago when we were seeing the rise of white nationalists on the Facebook platform, and we were trying to get Facebook to do something about it. We were having Black Lives Matter activists that were being approached by people offline, white men with guns showing up to a Black woman's home who was a Black Lives Matter activist, and threatening her and telling her to watch her back. We watched as Facebook worked with law enforcement without warrants to allow to have Facebook Lives turned off during police interactions. And then this woman, Corrine Gaines, ended up dead. And we did not have she was filming it and then it was turned off. And so, trying to work with Facebook was incredibly hard. We launched campaigns, we pushed. It's a major corporation that the CEO has 60% of the shares. And it's a public square that's owned by a private person. And a public square owned by a private person, regardless of their politics, right? They could have the exact same politics that I have, and I wouldn't want them controlling a public square, and you shouldn't want me controlling a public square either. But all of that to say, like the sort of nature of that was really hard. But if we didn't have folks on the inside willing to take a stand, to raise their voice, it would have kept, we wouldn't have been in this process. At the same time, we faced a tremendous amount of pushback. And so even while we were at the table with Facebook, engaging back and forth, we found out in the New York Times that Facebook had hired a PR firm to attack us. I am like in DC, going to a meeting, and I get a call from the New York Times saying, "Did you see the story we just posted? Do you have a comment?" And I had not seen the story because a couple of my staff had called me and I was trying to prepare for the meeting. And I, like, you know, my staff loves to tell this story that you always answer our phone calls. But I looked at the call, I was like, I don't have time for this. And they were telling me that this story was breaking that I was not sort of in the middle of looking at. And they had launched a camp, they had hired this PR firm basically to run what was essentially a racist and anti-Semitic campaign against Color of Change, right? Calling us puppets of George Soros. George Soros wasn't our biggest funder. I think we have more money from him now, but he was like, it was like not enough money for it to be a problem. I was like, well, we should get more money if we're gonna be like, but like basically that we were controlled by George Soros. And I don't have to go into all the ways in which sort of that is deeply anti-Semitic, and it isn't just a thing that we dealt with, but is a history of civil rights activists having to deal with it. From some of my conversations with the young activists, hearing the stories about how Julian Bond was attacked from Julian Bond and others. But it wasn't just anti-Semitic; it's anti-Black, because it promotes this idea that Black people lack the intellect, the vision, the strategy to design our own fight for a future, and that anyone who's supporting our efforts must be controlling us because we need to be controlled. Our communities have dealt with these things together, and now I am like dealing with it from a PR firm that is pitching around these stories. We instantly jumped into action and launched a campaign. We have forced Facebook to do a civil rights audit. We are in the middle of a civil rights audit, and every phase we've had to engage with white allies, non-Black allies, who at various times have leaned in to support us, to be able to give us tips, to be able to, like, you know, help point us in the right direction. We are a strategic organization. We think a lot about strategy, but we don't always know what we don't know. And that has been incredibly helpful as we continue to build power around Facebook. And even the uprisings of Facebook staff right now, pushing back against some of the ways the platform has been used in really targeted and racist ways to suppress the vote and to threaten protesters. Facebook employee base is 4% Black. So an employee uprising of just Black people is not going to be helpful. And so it only works if there are allies raising up and speaking out. And I don't just think about allyship, I think about being co-conspirators, those who see their fate as tied to our fate. At every phase in so many of our work, I can point to folks inside of institutions, sometimes really in silent ways, sending us information that could be helpful, and we sort of maybe pretend we don't know who they are in the hallway. Or folks who have been willing to speak out in more powerful ways and take risks. All of those things have to be part of the effort to undo these practices, to undo the policies. And so, you know, a lot of our work is about corporate accountability. And the reason why it is about corporate accountability is because so much of our country so many of the rules are situated to protect corporations. And we have to do as much as we can to hold those institutions accountable, to change the rules of them, to not just think that like Black people could do better under broken rules, but to recognize that the rules are the problem.
Excellent. I'm getting a bunch of questions about the election in November. So I do want to turn to that, while noting, of course, that no single election outcome, of course, is going to stem the tide of racial injustice in America, but definitely a necessary step in the right direction to change the white nationalist occupant of the White House. And that is J Street's top strategic priority in the coming months, speaking of strategy. I've lost track of the number of coalitions that you're a part of when it comes to the November elections. I'm interested in your perspective, and I'm getting, again, a number of questions from from J Street activists about this on a couple of things with regards to the election.
Yeah.
What,
So sorry, keep going.
what tactically, strategically, beyond the chatter on cable news, just prognosticating about outcomes in the election, what tactically that might be counterintuitive should organizations like ours be mindful of as we plan to try to influence the election outcome in November? And when it comes to working in coalition, what kind of coalition should we all be looking to build looking ahead to November? And then finally, of course, we're interested in the top of the ballot, but you also spoke about a number of more local offices where racial justice issues that are certainly at the fore right now are even more so arguably on the ballot. And what are some of those offices that we should all be mindful of as we fill out our ballot?
Yeah, that's a lot. So if I'm gonna and if I miss something, you'll come back in and
We'll keep you honest.
Yeah, all right, great, thank you. So our kind of electoral program really is, I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but it is very much focused on a couple of things. One is that a lot of the folks that we need to turn out don't have been sold a story about voting and elections that is not always true. And so I think of voting as, if I think about it in an exercise analogy, I think about voting as the stretching of civic engagement, right? Stretching may not help you lose the last 5 pounds if that is your goal. But if you don't stretch, you're gonna hurt later. And so in so many ways, and in particular in this time, we're gonna hurt a lot more. And so I think that this is the most important election of my lifetime. And so I don't wanna understate the importance of this election. And I say that to say that that is how we are approaching it as an organization. And so what we've focused on through our electoral work is always focused on what people in the voting space call low propensity voters. We like to call them high potential voters. And we focus on high potential Black voters, and we start in the voter file at 0 and generally work up to people who may have voted for Obama, but no one else. May have voted in 1 Obama election or 2 Obama elections, but nothing else. That's sort of where we hit on the voter file. And we run the largest volunteer-driven Black voter mobilization program in the country. We engaged about 15,000 volunteers back in 2018, reaching about 4 million voters. We raised about $5 million into our political arm. And we did that work sort of really focused on this idea of peer-to-peer engagement, that the candidate is not going to be the most important, that people want to not just be told the story of this person being elected and going into office and solving our problems, but they want to recognize, they want a full strategy, they want a full story about, we put this person in office and then we work to hold them accountable. And sometimes we make choices about who we're voting for that is not always about voting for the person that we want to engage with or the person that we want to have a beer with. And that, and our program starts with district attorneys. And it starts with district attorneys for a number of reasons. One is that they are the most powerful actors in the criminal justice space, and our members consistently tell us and then show us through their actions that criminal justice is not if not the top, one of the top 2 issues for our constituency, both in terms of our polling and in terms when we look on the back end in terms of the data and how people and what people actually take action. Sometimes what people say is very different than what they do in terms of action. And so we start with district attorneys. We've done some control testing though, so to really understand how people think about it. And we've actually seen in control tests that we've done in Cook County, as well as Harris County, Cook County, Illinois, and Harris County, Texas, that we've actually, when we've done turnout efforts that had a control where we didn't talk to certain aspects of the community about the DA race, and we talked to all the others, we've been able to increase turnout among young Black folks at a statistically significant level. And as a result, really not only get folks to the polls, but folks were able to vote a ballot. We were actually also able to tell people an honest story about how change happens. Sometimes it's hard to go to people and say, I know you're upset about the criminal justice system, but if you just go and you vote for your state legislator, things will change. Well, they may not change if the state legislator doesn't turn over party-wise, or if the state legislature, or if the person you elect is a freshman and doesn't have any power to introduce legislation. And then you start getting into all those details with people and they look at you like your eyes, but when you elect a new DA and we hold them accountable, on the first day they can go to office and they can say, I'm not prosecuting any of these crimes. I am not taking money bail. And so we have gone around the country doing this. And you know, sometimes people will say, are you just trying to elect more Black DAs? And I'm always like, we're a Black organization, so the tie goes to the Black person. But in many places, we have gone out and had to endorse and support candidates who are not Black. I had to go on every Black radio station in Philadelphia and explain why we endorsed Larry Krasner and why he was the best candidate. And a couple of the radio stations made me take callers, didn't tell me before, and I had to explain to the callers why we were endorsing Larry Krasner, which was very easy, and very easy to talk about his record. And it'll be even easier when we go back to support his reelection. All of those things, because of what he's done in office. We are able to tell a story, right? We went back to Ferguson 4 years afterwards, opened an office in downtown Ferguson, cut turf for the local organizers, door walking list. We went out and we started having our folks knock on doors, do peer-to-peer text messaging. It was tough. And you know, we started looking at the data and numbers and realized that we couldn't just win with increasing the turnout of Black folks in St. Louis County. And so we started engaging young white folks around what the kind of future they wanted, and having our folks knock on the doors and relate back the demands of the uprising. And you know, and try to center the uprising in that story, right? Not thinking about racial justice as a thing we wouldn't talk about, but making, once again, racial justice the driver for people's participation. And we went back and there was a poll about the week before the election. I think this is an important piece around all this. There was a poll the week before election saying that we were gonna lose by about 10 points. And I started having funders pulling out the last monies that they committed to. And I started worrying, like my staff's like, no, I think we're gonna do better. We're seeing a lot of stuff on the ground. And I was like, that point, I listened to the staff. I was like, okay, well, we're already here. So we're gonna go all we won by about 8 points. We kicked Bob McCullough out of office, the DA that would not prosecute. We put someone else in office, right? Translating protests to power, helping people recognize who may be unclear about why elections matter, why they do matter, why they can have results. Putting Wesley Bell, a young Black district attorney, in office, who has changed the rules around money bail, who has challenged and held police accountable, has done a whole set of new things in his office. And so what we are thinking about is all the ways that we channel energy to the election, but not just going to communities and say we care about Black voters, but going to communities and say we care about Black people. And when you care about Black people, you can unlock the power of Black voters, because people know you're not just showing up there to help politicians get new jobs. You're helping them make their lives better. And that's what elections have to be about at the end of the day. And so we're gonna run this program, and we're gonna work to engage tens of thousands of volunteers. And we're gonna try through our program, which is called Voting While Black, the Voting While Black program. And we also, as part of that, build a lot of content, run a sort of very sophisticated digital program in alignment with it. And all of that to say is that the election is incredibly important to us. We engage on district attorneys, we engage up and down the ballot, but our first goal is working to get people to the polls, working to build a volunteer engagement, working to ensure that if we expand the base of Black people turning out to vote, what that does as well is it sends a message to those in power that we created a new voting base, and a voting base that you have to keep through the things that you do. We put you in and we will take you out. And that is, I think, the power of expanding the base, instead of simply concentrating on how do we convince people who may have voted for Donald Trump that they shouldn't have done that. If we expand the base, then we don't spend the next several years trying to convince people, trying to fight for progressive change. We spend the next couple of years leveraging the power of the people who turned out to force progressive change.
So the remaining questions we're getting, Rashad, here are actually build pretty neatly on what you just discussed. They're about moving from protest to power to policy, I would say. So with this last question, would be interested in, the people on this call, a lot of us J Street activists were interacting with candidates quite a bit, mainly for House and Senate, but other candidates as well, local candidates as well. We're vetting those candidates based on, their approach to the Middle East primarily, but also, the degree to which they conform to our social justice values. Interested in your thoughts, Rashad. Protest to power to policy. What specifically we should be looking for these policymakers to be committing to doing, and what policies that may not be as newsy should we be pushing folks on to implement when they get that power?
Yeah, well, so backing up from the power, from the kind of policy, I think what we're trying to create litmus tests for candidates around what type of money they take. Right? It's one thing you say you want to end private prisons, but if you take private prison money, I don't know if I'm ever going to get you to like actually go against private prisons. If you want to end money bail, but you take money from the bail industry, don't know if you're going to end police violence and you take money from the Fraternal Order of Police, don't know if you can do that. And so I think that sometimes politicians will give us a list of the what. Of all the things. And lots of times we end up with a lot of politicians that will say the right things. This is the experience that Black people have with the Democratic Party, is a lot of like lists of policies that they're for, right? And we can get people to be for a lot of things. So I am less always interested. I am obviously interested, but less interested in the what, especially when we can get aligned. And I'm more interested in the how. Because sometimes we're told a story that we can just bring people together and change will happen. And I see this in focus groups of young Black folks who, and when I say young Black folks, I'm talking about, I'm no longer a young Black person. And so I go around talking about young Black people the way that like, I used to be annoyed as like a youth activist, but I'm doing it. And now I've got to like, figure out if I had a time machine to go back and give people grace that I didn't, maybe that I wish I have now. But seeing in the poll that they don't believe the story that is being told, that we just come together and make change. They were there. Many of them were there. Just watch all of the sort of fight that President Obama had to making any type of real change. So they know that the system is set up in a way where we don't just come together, that we actually have to undo entrenched forces. And so I'm oftentimes interested in who are people standing up to? Are you standing up to the banks that are exploiting us? Are you standing up to the insurance companies that are putting us in harm's way and make it impossible for us to be healthy? Are you standing up for against tax policies and those that advocate for it? You know, when I talk about charitable solutions to structural problems, over the last, I don't know, week. So Color of Change doesn't take corporate money. It's a very unique position in the Black civil rights space. And it, for the most part, every corporations know it, and we never get really offered any money until these last week, where like I wake up every day with like all these Instagram posts of corporations saying they're giving us money and they hadn't even told us. Or like random members of my campaigns team getting emails from corporations, like corporate leaders, like junior level staff getting emails because the only email they could find was from the campaigner that was emailing them about a campaign we were running on them. And that was the email to Color of Change that they had. And they were emailing that person about a donation. And, you know, this is the what, not the, this is the how, not the what, right? Folks will say Black Lives Matter, right? And then support a whole set of issues that clearly show that Black lives don't matter. And so what we're constantly trying to do is force politicians to actually, to not tell us, but to show us, and to constantly show us through their actions. And so the other thing that I think, you know, there was a question about, you know, kind of allyship and showing up earlier. I think more people, especially in this moment, right, where our fates are tied, right? The turnout in this election, we're tied together, right, of getting, you know, change at 16. I try not to like center 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and our advocacy, because people can hate Trump, but they might not love our side in return. And they might not love our side in return because they may not see us taking on the public fights and animating sort of the issues that make them believe that we're going to do the things that they need. And so we can't just say we stand up for working class people if we're not actually showing it through the ways we show up. We can't just say we care about the planet, but take a whole bunch of money from polluters. All of those things will matter. And I think like the more we have other folks pushing politicians to not just say what they care about, but to show that they care about through the money that they take, through the associations that they develop, and through the sort of other ways that they show up, I think that we can do the work to build more enthusiasm and the type of enthusiasm we're going to need.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Rashad. I'm going to let you get the last word. There's tons of questions left, but I just want to say to everybody joining us that this is about more than any one conversation. It's about more than the events of these last couple of weeks. And that living our values is going to require all of us to recommit to doing this work going forward into the future in a sustainable, in a sustained fashion. And we at J Street are committed to that. I want to give you again the last word, Rashad, what you want to leave folks with front of mind as we give you back the rest of your day.
Great. Well, I grew up on Eastern Long Island, the last exit on the Long Island Expressway, and I grew up in a community like that's about 10% Black. And so I grew up every day sort of understanding that we had to have multiracial coalitions to win. Like Black people needed other folks to like get someone on the school board that would care about Black students, get someone on the town council that would ensure that our streets were cleaned when it snowed, and all the things. And so I learned about politics at an early age and learned about how to build power, never as sort of that any single community can do it together. And so I just want to invite you all in to Color of Change, into a movement that is working to build power, a movement that is growing, and a movement that is focused on winning. Because when we win, we can then continue to grow that, and we can turn those wins into change that makes people's lives better. And so you can visit us at colorofchange.org. I hope you'll check out our district attorney and prosecutor site at winningjustice.org. The blackresponse.org is our prosecutor accountability hub. And Color of Change PAC, or Voting While Black, is where we do our political work. And each one of these places are places where we're both trying to educate people and channel action. And so thank you all for having me. Really, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the way you've opened up your platform today and given me a chance to share our stories. And I hope that we will find ways to work together, and this won't be the last time we engage. And maybe the next time we engage in person, maybe we're doing it in ways where we're celebrating all the victories that we've been able to have in November that will propel the type of change that all of our communities deserve. So thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ben, for moderating.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rashad. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thanks for your important work. And thanks to everybody at Color of Change.
Thank you very much.
Have a great rest of your day.